Well, good evening. It's great to see you all here. Could have been watching either the Huskies or Gonzaga, I suppose, tonight. Maybe we should do a poll on what you think is going to be the outcome, but we won't. So the topic, the VA health system, is clearly a timely topic. In part because of the media coverage over the last few years, which focused on issues around quality and access to care for veterans, and the related discussions that are happening even now in Washington, D.C. There are two fact sheets that you probably found, hopefully you found, I know you found on your seats, that provide, I think, some basic information about the VA. It is the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States. I actually thought I read that it was the largest integrated healthcare system in the world at one point. It's big. Okay, Suzanne's saying no. Okay, I'll just say I read it someplace, not on the internet. It cares for over 9 million veterans. And, like many healthcare systems, many veterans report that they are very happy and satisfied with the care that they receive. But people have varying experiences. And I know for a fact that those experiences vary across the country. My parents were both World War II veterans, and they got extraordinarily good care in Milwaukee from the VA, even while all the media coverage that was sort of negative about what was going on with the VA was happening. So it was a sort of cognitive dissonance for me. Okay, as the panel comes up to the table, I'm going to introduce them. Yes, go, please. Please come to the table. So on your left, Suzanne Gordon. Suzanne is the author of Wounds of War, an award-winning journalist and the Senior Policy Fellow at the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. Jim Tushmet is with Providence Health System, previously served as the Acting Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Health in the Department of Veterans Affairs from 2014 through 2015, where he helped to implement the choice legislation, which I'm sure we'll hear about tonight. Next to Jim is Kelly Wadsworth. Kelly is a pastor, served as a military chaplain for more than a decade, and is a member of Veterans for Peace, and receives care at the VA in Seattle. Steve Finn is the head of General Internal Medicine at the University of Washington. After spending 36 years at the Department of Veterans Affairs, including running the Northwest VA Health Services Research and Development Center of Excellence here in Seattle. And finally, Hugh Foy. Hugh has been teaching medical students for, 16, 18 years. He's a professor of surgery at Harborview, where he's been since 1991. He was a resident at the VA here in Seattle in the late 1970s, and he's the co-founder of the Western Washington chapter of Physicians for a National Health Group. Okay, so here's another chance. This is the exercise in democracy or populism or something. So if you will go to the Poll Everywhere site, it's very easy. You just put in like the card on your seat, just put it in your browser on whatever not so smart machine you have. And so this is a nifty 4x4 4-quadrant matrix. Now we set up sort of a false dichotomy, right, with this the title of this forum. It's sort of reminiscent of do you walk to work or take your lunch? No? Yes, I can do both. Nonetheless, despite that, somewhat absurdity. We'd like to get your initial thoughts about the VA's future. Should it be privatized or act as a model for single payer? So you can see that you can choose your place in those quadrants, and I think on your phone, you just put your finger on in the quadrant, you know, where you are right now, and I think if you have a cursor, you could probably click on it as well. You know, let's see. Ooh, populating quickly. Let's see what the commonalities and divergences are. So right now, nobody thinks it's a terrible idea to think of the VA as a single payer, and it looks like there's at least a plurality of people who have a feeling like they don't really want the VA privatized, but there's a significant number, there's a few in any case who we hope we will hear from and about that think privatization in some way, shape, or form might be good. Okay, I think we'll move on. So we're going to ask this question again at the end. So the point here is to keep an open mind. Strive to learn something. Think about what your preconceived notions are, your assumptions. We've got an amazing panel here with lots of experience, and they may tell us something we don't know, we haven't thought about. We'll have an opportunity at the end, I think Michelle mentioned this, for Q&A, for questions from the audience. So be thinking about questions as you hear from the speakers. Okay, so to the panel. We're going to start with Suzanne and go down the line. And basically, what I'd like each of you to do is respond, you know, to this notion. In a sense, the title of this symposium sets up a continuum of futures for the VA, right? From a model as a single payer to privatization. So I just want you to respond to that in whatever way you feel appropriate. James is sitting right here. James has time cards. You have 8 minutes for this thing. What? No, they have 8 minutes, so, you know, they're going to talk. They're panelists. And he's got a 3-minute, a 1-minute, and a 0-minute. And I'm going to run a very tight ship. So he's going to have those signs in your face. When he gets to 0, I'm going to cut you off, okay? That's the rules. So with that, Suzanne.
Thank you. So in the rules speed dating model here.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for having me. I've spent 35 years researching and writing about healthcare in the private sector, about nursing, patient safety, and teamwork, and 6 years writing and researching the VHA and for this book, Wounds of War, which I hope you will all buy because I'm a shameless peddler of my books. I spend a fair amount of time consulting in the VHA as well. And the VHA is the Veterans Health Administration. So really when we're talking about privatizing the VA, we're talking about privatizing the Veterans Health Administration, which is the largest healthcare system in the country. And I think privatization would be a disaster for veterans and a disaster for all Americans because the VHA doesn't just serve veterans, it serves all of us. I think that the VHA should be considered a model of how care could be delivered if we had a rational healthcare system in America. I think I'm a strong supporter of some form of nationally supported healthcare system like exists in every other industrialized country except our own. I think that actually the slogan should be VA care for all, not Medicare for all, because the Medicare is a payer, not a system, and the VA is a payer and a provider, which is why it has the outcomes that it has. I think the VA, I've spent 6 years sitting in VA hospitals, facilities, rehab hospitals, blind rehab centers, PTSD programs, traumatic brain, I mean, you name it. It's a huge system. Obviously, I couldn't be everywhere. It's got 1,700 sites of care, 170 medical centers. There's so many medical centers that the VA can't sometimes even keep track of how many medical centers there are. And I think the models of teamwork, safety, quality, coordination, and integration of care are what we should all experience in our healthcare and what we sadly don't. And I think that if we do have which I hope we will eventually get, I think if we ever do have some sort of Medicare for all single-payer healthcare system where provision and insurance are joined, I think that the VA should be embedded in that system, not replaced by it. Because as long as we continue to have these terrible wars, which in my view are terribly misguided and unnecessary, and we keep producing all these wounded warriors, and by the way, you don't have to be a wounded veteran you don't have to have been in combat to have been a wounded veteran. I mean, many veterans suffer all kinds of exposures just never having left the continental United States, and we have to take care of those occupational injuries. So I believe that we must have the VA be part of that system, and we could eliminate a lot of the stupid eligibility requirements that pit veteran against veteran, citizen against citizen, and that really don't serve the needs of veterans or all Americans. I think that after having experienced VA healthcare, not as a patient, but as an observer, I know, and I can say this with utter conviction, that I, who have the best health insurance in the country, I can go anywhere I want, practically to anyone I want. I will never get the kind of care veterans get at the VA when it's at its best, because it just doesn't exist in the private sector healthcare system. You have care at the VHA for patients who are cherry-picked because they are older, sicker, and poorer, right? The VA cannot take you as a patient if you are healthier and wealthier. You're not eligible. You're not in a top priority group. And they deliver this care, this integrated care, at a much lower cost and at higher quality than is available in the private sector. I think that the VA's model of integrated coordinated care cannot exist in the private sector the way the private sector is currently constructed. And that is because no matter how well-intentioned its individual providers, our private sector U.S. healthcare system is profit-driven, not mission-driven. It is fragmented, not coordinated, and it's largely organized around the provision of disconnected episodic medical procedures and treatments. That's why we have the highest healthcare costs in the industrialized world, and why so many patients die from unnecessary preventable medical errors and injury. I think that the VA healthcare system, some of the things you have to know about it are on these sheets, but it is fully integrated. It integrates mental health and primary health care. It has one of the best electronic medical records in the country, even in the world, which is about to be dismantled. It has systems of care, of primary care, of geriatric care, of palliative care, of end-of-life care, of mental health care. It is the nation's really only public health system because it deals with things like chronic homelessness, with education issues, with readjustment issues, and so forth. And it's delivered in a healthcare system that is veteran-centric. Why? Because it takes care of our veterans. And veterans have very specific healthcare issues. They have more chronic pain, more suicidality, more mental and behavioral health problems, more homelessness, et cetera, than the average patient in the private sector. The average 65-year-old patient in the private sector has 3 to 5 comorbidities or presenting problems. The average Vietnam vet has 9 to 12. When we consider the question of privatization, and make no mistake about it, under this current Mission Act that is being implemented now, more and more care of veterans will be outsourced to the private sector, and that is incremental privatization, even though the VA secretary denies that what they are doing is privatization. When we consider the question of privatization, of whether privatization is a good idea, those of you in the room who think it is a good idea, I implore you to think about several questions. One is the private sector capable of absorbing more than 9 million complex veteran patients and serving their needs? Is it capable of delivering timely, high-quality care? I believe that any reasonable analysis of the current conditions will lead people to say a resounding no. We have a serious problem in our country with shortages of primary care physicians. We need something like 45,000 more by 2030, and our medical schools and residency programs aren't producing them. 55% of all counties in the United States have no psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker. Where are veterans going to get care in those counties, all of which are rural? 92 rural hospitals have closed in the last decade, and 700 are expected to close in the next decade. Where are veterans who live in rural areas? Many of them do live in rural areas, going to get care. We have a horrible crisis of preventable medical injuries and errors. Can I read my last paragraph, or are you going to come?
One paragraph.
Okay. So I just want to quote from a VA report supporting the dangerous access standards being currently promulgated by the VA Secretary and his Koch brother and industry-funded advisors. The report states that VA wait times in care regularly outperform the private sector, and that veterans prefer to get their care at the VHA. If this is the conclusion of proponents of outsourcing more and more veteran care to the private sector, of starving the VA of resources, of refusing to fill 43,000 vacancies at the VHA, we have to ask what is going on. And I think the only logical answer to that question is that we are seeing the push for privatization of the VHA system, not improving and strengthening the system, because of an anti-government, radical libertarian ideology driving this movement, and because of the financial interests of some of the private sector healthcare industry that is interested in capturing the VA pot of gold. I believe our decisions need to be made on the needs of veterans and the rest of the patients like you and me that the VHA serves, and I don't think that is what is happening today. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Jim.
Thanks. I too would say I feel very privileged to be asked to be here tonight. I think the VA, there are many things about the VA that private sector could learn from, that could serve as an example for private sector healthcare. The quality in the VA, no matter kind of how you slice and dice and look at it, whether it's patient safety, the HEDIS metrics that people follow around prevention and chronic disease management, the VA is as good or better than private sector. And VA has done that for a long time, and private sector has actually caught up. Parts of private sector have caught up with the VA's performance. And the VA does that, I would contend, at a lower cost structure than Medicare, particularly when you kind of look at the population served by the VA versus Medicare, and kind of the difference in benefits covered by the VA versus by Medicare. And in general, commercial side of private sector healthcare is much more expensive than Medicare. VA focuses really, I think, outstandingly well on prevention and ambulatory services, has extraordinary capabilities for mental health, which is usually sorely lacking in private sector, and really, I think, coordinates care across the entire continuum. And those are things I think that the VA does very, very well. And I think it does that in part because the economic incentives within the organization are really aligned. There's a culture of stewardship to manage affordability that exists within the organization. They can negotiate drug prices, which private sector healthcare generally cannot do, particularly Medicare cannot do. And we really, the VA follows evidence-based medicine around formulary, supply chain management, and other things like that. And particularly, I think, in partnership with VBA, can address some of the health determinants of disease, homelessness, food insecurity. They have, job training and that kind of thing, addiction therapy programs. So I think there is much that can be learned. I think I often compare the VA to Kaiser Permanente because those two organizations share a lot of DNA, I think, in common. There are things the VA doesn't do very well that I think private sector would be foolish to try and replicate. If you looked at the kind of word salad that was up here at the beginning, it is big. It can be anonymous and impersonal in many ways. There are a lot of regulations and rules that are hard for veterans to understand, and quite frankly, hard for staff to understand and deliver, explain those things in a consistent way across the country. There's 350,000 employees in the Veterans Health Administration. So I think there are some really good things that can be used as examples, but for me, there's a but at the end of all of that. And the reality, I think, for the VA is that the veteran population, which is currently at about 20 million veterans in this country, is expected, the VA predicts, that population will decline by about 30% over the next 15 to 16 years. The Vietnam War was really the last war that was fought with kind of full-time, regular, active-duty military personnel. Since then, wars have been fought with guard troops. Particularly if you look at World War II, but even Vietnam, people came back and left the military and stayed in places where they left, departed from military service. And so they were concentrated, particularly in cities like LA, Seattle. But today, those guard troops come back and they go back into every county in the United States. And so, for that reason, accessibility has become a major problem over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly for the VA, a geographical accessibility problem. And then there is a timeliness of access issue. And I think that I would contend, I work in private sector now, there are those same access issues in private sector. If you look at the appointment data, you can get an appointment today in the VA pretty comparable to private sector, but there are delays and access issues, I think, around acute care and around specialty care. So you might get in to see your orthopedic surgeon for a visit in a timely way, but you might wait a long time to get your hip replacement done if it's an elective procedure. So I think the other point I would just make is if you look at the VA infrastructure, it's old. Some of the VA hospitals were built in the early 1900s. The cost of building a new VA hospital in Denver was almost $2 billion. I'll just tell you a short story in that when I was working in central office, we wanted to centralize calls to call centers, much like Kaiser does. When you call a Kaiser clinic, you're actually talking to somebody in a call center to schedule an appointment or get a drug refill, et cetera. And we had a contractor look at helping us do that. And they came back and said, you have a problem because your phones are still on PBX systems, they're not digital. And I said, well, that's okay, well, what's it cost to fix that? Well, the answer is just to bring the phone systems in the VA up to digital standards would have cost $3 billion. I don't see American taxpayers investing in the VA infrastructure to maintain that. And I think that if you kind of marry all that up, declining veteran population, people in every county, really aging infrastructure, that's not a formula for success in my mind. And I think that, I would say, I don't know that the VA is going to be privatized. We could debate that. That's probably why we're here tonight. But I would predict that the VA of the future is not going to be the VA of the past.
Thank you. Great. Kelly.
Good evening. I have the great pleasure to speak this evening as a post-9/11 Iraq War veteran, and I hope my comments here do a service to my sisters and brothers, both in the audience and those from recent wars. I served from 2001 to 2011 as an Army chaplain, with time spent in the National Guard, in the reserves, on active duty. My veteran perspective is equally informed by my experiences as a patient here in Seattle at the Seattle VA. From my vantage point, the future of the VA is best answered by looking to the future of veterans themselves. In September of 2017, 7 years after my deployment to Iraq, I was working at a local nonprofit not too far from here when the front office called me to sign for a delivery. When I arrived, I discovered that it was Joe, the delivery guy, someone I had known, bringing a tank of helium that the director had ordered so that we could blow up our own balloons for our monthly birthday celebrations. Joe then proceeded to explain how I needed to securely attach the tank to a concrete post just in case it tipped over and inadvertently became a projectile missile. Upon hearing this, I slowly began to walk away from Joe and the death trap that he had so cavalierly brought into the building. Noticing the color draining out of my face and my sudden stuttering of words, Joe offered to carry the helium tank himself to our basement storage area while I returned to my office, visibly shaken. By the grace of God, one of my colleagues noticed my distress and offered to be the point of contact for all future helium deliveries. For you see, helium tanks look quite a bit like an IED or a roadside bomb. But I was never hit by one, so I was surprised by my response. But the soldiers in my unit were, and the service members at the base hospital where I worked were. And I buried some of them. Not all of us carry a debilitating fear of helium balloons, but we do carry depression and anxiety and chronic pain and worn out knees and embedded shrapnel and toxic poisons and immune system problems, mysterious cancers, addiction, guilt, disassociation, and sadness. Comprehensive veteran health care, therefore, is a no-brainer. But veterans do not exist in a bubble. They exist as members of families, and they have spouses and partners and children and parents and relatives and neighbors and friends and coworkers. And all of these people need to be healthy for veterans to be healthy. The individual tasks that we carry can range from tending to the physical and psychological implications of brain injuries. We have to tend to absent limbs from roadside bombs. We tend to PTSD from deathly encounters. And we tend to an inexcusable suicide rate. But there are other tasks, collective ones, that us veterans also manage in our daily lives, but they are not ours alone to carry. Some of us have a spidey sense that works overtime and is extremely perceptive at picking up disturbances in the force, things that are out of place, behavior that doesn't fit. These veterans are the guardians of our public spaces. There are others of us who can no longer bury our heads in the sand pretending that the day-to-day decisions of ordinary civilians have nothing to do with the wars we wage overseas. These veterans are the guardians of our moral fiber. And still, for some of us, our experiences have carved canyons of sorrow so deep in our soul that it would take many lifetimes to grieve it all. These veterans are the guardians of life in a numb and distressed society. And these are some of the most important tasks that we can tackle, and every veteran I know is shouldering the weight of them in some kind of way. Which is why the question of privatization on the one hand and single payer on the other is best addressed by asking who exactly needs to be healthy. For society to be healthy, veterans need health care. For veterans to be healthy, the rest of society needs health care. Privatization has some similarities to contracting out, and we are 15 years into Middle East wars where we contracted out logistics, supply, food, water, security, and not to mention the other unsavory jobs that we paid to have done. And this is not a position, I would say, of integrity or honor. We should have 3 to 4 times the number of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan that we do. And veteran health care is not like a cup of coffee or the purchase of a car or a mortgage on a home. Instead, it is a public good, more like roads and water and schools, things that need a high degree of integration and public support in order to work well. On the other hand, I'm also cautious about any endeavor which expands the federal government, and I support a VA for all with both eyes open, understanding that due diligence and accountability are essential parts of the equation. I hung up my combat boots 9 years ago. I packed my uniform away, and my salute is rusty. But the chaplain in me lives on, and my soldiers and their families need an integrated, streamlined system. I experienced this at the VA in ways that I did not experience it in the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Steve.
I'd also like to express my thanks for being here. In addition to the roles Aaron described that I had in the VA, that is serving as a VA primary care physician for 36 years and directing a research center for almost 20, I had the good fortune to have several other roles in VA. I directed a primary care clinic, and beginning in the days before it was actually legal to deliver primary care in the VA. I served in central office as the Chief Quality and Performance Officer, as the Chief of VA Research, and my last job as the Director of Analytics and Business Intelligence. So I've had the opportunity to look at VA from a variety of perspectives. And as I answer this question about where the VA should go, I can't help but look back at the history of the organization. I think that's important to know and complements the notion of looking forward. It's important to recognize that the government has provided health care to veterans directly following every war since the Revolutionary War. In the early years, this was largely custodial care, but following World War II, the country made a commitment to improve its care of veterans, and not only health care, but also, as Jim mentioned, provision of education and financial security through loans and pensions. Many, I think, have come to regard this as a covenant between the country and in exchange for those who devoted years of their lives and often their lives themselves for the country. And to meet this challenge, shortly following World War II, General Omar Bradley made in a two-page memo an agreement with the medical schools of this country to provide high-quality care to veterans in exchange for educational opportunities to medical trainees. And for the next 4 decades, the VA system steadily expanded. And as you've heard described already, to provide the best possible care to veterans. And ultimately, as you all know, the VA was converted into a cabinet department in the 90s. And since then, however, as Jim alluded, has been relatively static in terms of its size. Like so many large federal programs, the VA has been a bit of an experiment. There was no formula or example preceding it. And I would submit to you that it's, as you've heard, been a very successful experiment. VA's furnished, as we've heard, high-quality care to tens of millions of veterans over the last 70 years, provided training to well over 1 million healthcare professionals. Along the way, VA pioneered the electronic health record, supported Nobel Prize-winning research, and provided global leadership in caring for conditions like PTSD, hypertension, spinal cord injury, and chronic medical conditions. And as also said, this has been accomplished at a net cost lower than it would have been to have provided this service within the private sector. I think often forgotten and not mentioned is the fact that the VA has provided employment and a sense of purpose to hundreds of thousands of Americans who actually work in the VA. I am one of those individuals. Most certainly, and we could, I'm sure in discussion they'll come up, there have been stumbles and deficiencies that have received vocal criticism. But overall, again, I think this has been a very successful experiment and probably arguably as successful as any other large government program in this country. Tens of thousands of lives have been improved and many saved. And many believe, including I'm sure, as I gather from this audience, that the VA has demonstrated how a federally funded, globally budgeted healthcare delivery system could work. But I share some of the concerns that Jim Tuchschmidt has outlined. One, the demographics of a declining veteran population. Two, the outdated facilities with an average age approaching 60 years. And the maldistribution of those facilities, which mirrors where veterans lived 40 and 50 years ago when those facilities were built, and not where they live now. And complicated by the fact that the VA promises to deliver healthcare services to every veteran, irrespective of where they reside. No health insurance company would do that, and it's difficult. And those are 3 of the 4 big obstacles I see to VA. And the largest, which I'm surprised no one has mentioned so far, is the erratic and inconsistent management by both the executive and legislative branches of our government, which I think is the most serious problem facing the VA. It's very difficult to operate perhaps the largest and most complicated health system in the nation in a highly politicized environment with increasing and changing mandates, and as Jim noted, very little flexibility or capability for long-term planning or budgeting. Based on these considerations, I had long expected that the VA would evolve over the next 2 to 3 decades, probably shrinking to meet the changing needs of a diminishing number of veterans. At this point, however, such a sensible and gradual glide path seems unlikely to me, if not impossible, as essential resources are being shoveled out of the system faster than the systems to track and manage them can be constructed. My expectation at this point is that veterans will likely be confused and disappointed when they experience difficulties in obtaining prompt and high-quality services in the private sector that do not conform to their expectations. And simultaneously, an underfunded VA system will be forced to continually reduce services. I do believe that VA has demonstrated that a globally budgeted national health care system can function effectively, as we've heard. But what I think I have also learned is that unless it's insulated from the ever-changing political whims, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to operate efficiently and effectively. Even the National Health Service in Britain, which is operated as a national trust, has had difficulty with politics interfering with the delivery of care. On the other hand, I think the complete or near complete privatization of the VA is apt to cost more and disappoint veterans, which has largely been the experience with TRICARE, which is the example for that. DOD has far more resources and experience in operating a health plan than the VA. So my hope is that, again, we'll reach the sort of happy sort of evolution that Dr. Tuchschmidt outlined for us, but I'm somewhat pessimistic that we'll be able to do that, but perhaps I'll be wrong.
Thank you. Hugh?
I would mirror and reflect a lot of the statements that have been made. Long story short, I'll begin at the end, and I think the VA should be maintained. I think underfunding is an issue that is at the whim of really reactionary politics, like many other things in our society. And we have to decide as a society and an electorate, really, if we feel that health care is a human right, or is it a privilege only afforded to those who can pay? Even if you can pay at top shelf insurance, if you fall ill, you lose your job or employee supported health care, and then you will become indigent, as been shown in several studies by the Harvard School of Public Health. 51% of American personal bankruptcy is filed because of health care expenditures. Of the people who filed for bankruptcy, 75% of them had health care coverage when they fell ill. So we are all at the whim and at a pink slip's mercy in this paper universe, as the old song goes, to our good luck and subsequent good health. So there's a lot of things. So I'm a health educator, I'm a general surgeon, I work at Harborview, I've been there continuously since 1991. I was a student at the VA during medical school. I worked at the VA as a resident. And so I see that from that perspective, and also from the perspective down the street at what is probably one of the last remaining other vestiges of public health institutions in our city, which is Harborview. And I can tell you that I think the VA is very well organized, as Suzanne has pointed out very well in her book, and I would, if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. It is truly an in-depth analysis of the VA and all that it has done in terms of its not just delivery of care, both inpatient and outpatient, but more importantly to the growing need of the psychosocial aspects of healthcare, particularly PTSD and other things. I can take somebody's gallbladder out. My colleague can bypass their blocked artery, but the tough work and the heavy lifting is taking care of people with PTSD, addiction, and other emotional issues. And I don't know about any of you, but even those of us with top shelf health insurance who have tried to access mental health care, it's nearly impossible. Nearly impossible if you have private insurance until your crisis escalates to a police activity. Try it sometime. I hope you don't have to. I have had to for family members and friends. So one of the best things that the VA does is comprehensive and very thorough analysis and treatment of people with these kind of social determinants of health, particularly psychosocial aspects. It is comprehensive both medically, socially, and I would argue geographically as well. I come from the flyover zone. I grew up in the tri-state area of Nebraska, as my New Jersey roommate described it as he drove with me, the sticks of the sticks. Yes, it is difficult to access health care due to vast geographic differences, but one of the things VA does well, and they did it well when I was a medical student in Omaha in 1976, is telehealth and teleeducation. And I think that's one of the great prospects, that it can be developed, not ignored, and allowed to wither on the vine. It fulfills this important social need, and it fulfills that promise to people who have served and now in this continuous war of nearly 30 years. Never before in our country's history have we had a situation like this. Yes, they come back. They're different than World War II veterans. They're different than perhaps the Vietnam veterans who saw enormous amounts of carnage. But still, the psychosocial aspects of what they come back and the burdens that they bear are incredible and need attention as well. The VA is also very innovative. Innovative in their development of the first and probably still best comprehensive electronic medical records, which really helps bind together a complex and diffuse healthcare system. Particularly in a teaching environment, it's the glue that helps hold us together and helps us deliver really quality care, where we have not just a record, but an X-ray at a fingertip's reach. I can look at a CT scan and scroll through it with 1 millimeter resolution while I lay on my back in the sunshine and in my backyard wireless. The VA developed the best EMR. They did it decades before anybody else, and they did it for a fraction of cost because it was open source and it was not for profit and it wasn't a proprietary silo. So the VA has done a lot of things in terms of innovation. And if you want to look at the inflection of healthcare costs, much of it is buried in the cost of proprietary, competitive electronic medical records, which I think is responsible for a huge part of the inflection curve of the cost. We paid X amount of dollars for a comprehensive EMR. It took us 10X and 10 years to implement it. We thought we bought a Lexus we could drive off the lot. Turned out it was crates of car parts, used Toyota car parts, to quote a former director of our institution. So I could go on at the innovation, but I think the VA should be maintained. It should be continued. It should be funded. We can't even fund public education in our state, let alone fund health care in this nation. But we've got to decide as an electorate, is health care a right? Or is it a privilege of the ever-shrinking ability, not just of those of us who have employee-based health insurance, but now it's to the point where you have to be wealthy. I mean, your job insurance won't even cover psychiatric visits in the private sector, and you won't even get a visit with a private psychiatrist for at least 3 weeks. So I think the VA should be maintained. It should be improved. Their systems of care and the dedication should be held as a model as we evolve from our fractured for-profit health insurance environment to a single-payer environment like they have in Canada. I don't think we should have a delivery system like the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. That's perhaps, and believe it or not, I can't believe I'm actually more moderate in that respect. I think we could keep our system of providers like Canada does, but we need to have a single payer mechanism and we need universal access. One of the advantages of the VA is when their demand expands, they're the only one in the whole country who can contract their eligibility and the supply of patients. I don't have that luxury at Harborview. Tonight there are 56 patients in a 400-bed hospital at Harborview who do not have a bed. 56 inpatients, and that's every night for 15 years. So I think keep the VA, make it a model, and we need a single payer mechanism for the financing, and we have to decide as an electorate, is it a right or is it a privilege of the 1%?
Thank you. So I sense a troubling level of consensus among the panelists, but I'm going to try to provoke maybe some lines of thought that we might explore. And I'm going to start off, actually, I'm just going to throw this out to whoever wants to respond to it. This morning I heard a story on our local NPR station about the opening of a new free clinic for veterans down in Lakewood near Olympia, down towards Olympia, that was funded by Stephen Cohen, who's a philanthropist, and he's putting $275 million into these clinics, about 25 clinics around the country. And this is the clinic is to support post 9/11 veterans and military families with mental health services, regardless of veterans' discharge status or ability to pay. The first clinic of its kind in the state. Now, it reminds me a little bit. We have free clinics that serve disenfranchised people in the general population. Those exist, I would say, in many communities around the country. So the need to create a clinic to serve post 9/11 veterans and provide them particularly with mental health care, what does that say about the current state of the VA? I mean, it sounds like a big hole. Suzanne.
Well, I would refer people to an article Jasper Craven and I did in The Nation on Stephen Cohen, who actually is, I wouldn't describe Stephen Cohen as a philanthropist. He is actually one of the most notorious hedge fund managers in the country. He was almost narrowly indicted and sent to jail for insider trading. And I think the Cohen Veteran Networks are a problem and a symptom. One of the things Cohen Veteran Networks do is, and by the way, the $275 million that he funded these clinics with for 5 years, he could actually fund them for the rest of his life because he has something like $14 billion. And it would represent very little. But one of the, and that is precisely the amount of money that was the insider trading scandal.
Okay, but what about the clinics?
Well, I think that, I think the clinics have, I think they are, as I said, a symptom of the fact that a lot of VA is underfunded and understaffed, and also that because Congress won't change this crazy rule about not letting veterans with other than honorable discharge is be cared for by the VA, except for now there's an order that they get 90 days of mental health care, which is not enough, and they haven't added extra staff to do it. I mean, I see this as both as sort of a problem and as a failure of the society to, adequately fund the VA. I mean, another problem with the Cone Network is that all of his clinics are, he said he was going to serve underserved areas, yet all of his clinics are being opened in places like Seattle where there are already VA clinics. So there are a lot of people that are concerned that he's actually trying to set up a competitive healthcare system with the VA. I mean, I think some of the people on this panel have pointed to the issue that, part of the problem is that the VA is underfunded and understaffed. We have 43,000 vacancies in the VA, and the Secretary has said in 2 hearings recently that he will not fill them. So you are sort of, I think, setting up, the VA for failure. It's like the underfunding the public schools, and, making inevitable that people, some with good intentions and some with not so good intentions, will be exploiting the taxpayer's dollar.
Thanks. Jim, you have
Yeah, I was just going to say, so, Kelly hung up her boots, but the one thing that is pretty common is, so many of the Guard folks come back from a deployment and put on their civilian clothes but they're still in the Guard, and they still want to go back. They still have a military career. And many of them are very reluctant to come into the VA and talk about PTSD or have mental health issues or have military sexual trauma because of a fear that that will end up getting into their record and affect their ability to be promoted or even stay in the military. So there is, it is a big issue. It is particularly a big issue with women who suffer military sexual trauma, and I think it's something that the VA has been trying to address, but it is a challenging situation.
Steve?
So, yeah, I would agree what was said. And, although I do find it odd that it's being placed, right next to a military hospital and a VA, a large VA clinic. The one thing that you said, and I hadn't read about this, that would be an advantage from my perspective is the opportunity to take care of families. One of the difficulties in the VA is that we can only take care of veterans, and there's been talk over the years of expanding eligibility to family members, and I think that would be an excellent improvement to the VA to expand that eligibility. I would also say that, in addition to sort of directly starving the VA for resources, one of the big shackles that's been applied is the inability to close underused facilities. So these older facilities that don't have, where resources could be transferred to those areas where there is high demand and increasing enrollment in the VA is practically impossible. And for those who, really want to know what happened in Phoenix, that's actually what happened. That was the area of the country with the highest growth of new veteran enrollees, and your budget's based on your activity from 3 years ago. So it's impossible really to respond promptly to those surges. So, I think in addition to, fully funding and not sending money out the door, to have given VA leadership the opportunity, which they haven't had for, 30 years, it's like closing a military base, only harder. To sort of be able to adjust to the changing demographics and changing needs.
Kelly and then Hugh.
For the clinic that you mentioned, one of the interesting pieces about it that you mentioned was the role of discharge and one's discharge status, and the ways that affects how much health care you're eligible for and how much you are not. And it plays into this idea that we earn our health care, that some are more deserving than others. And I think there do need to be some things in life and in society that we do earn. But I don't look at my children and think, well, which ones of you have earned your health care for this week and which ones of you haven't? I think in day-to-day life, it just doesn't work like that. I don't think we actually think in terms of earning or privilege, like rights or privileges. We just think the communities around us need to be healthy for us to be healthy. Our families need to be healthy for us to be healthy. The dishonorable discharge veteran needs to be healthy in order for me to be healthy. So I think it's maybe tapping into sort of this piece that is kind of unanswered, or it's not answered fully or adequately enough around the role of discharge. I have a colleague who was dishonorably discharged for drug use and then has struggled to have a job, so he has no health care, and so he has absolutely no way to get help for his addiction problems. And right like that begins to bypass whether you have the right to it or whether you've earned it or not. That just has the role of, do you have access to health or do you not?
You?
I would just echo what Kelly said about eligibility. Eligibility, again, is that fluctuating gatekeeper mechanism that the VA is so good at. There are, more than 8 categories? 8. If you're a Gulf War vet, you get it free for 5 years. If you're a Purple Heart recipient, right, you were wounded in action, you get it. If you were discharged with a disability, you can get it, and there's various ratings on the percentage. If you're a Southwest Asia Gulf War veteran, Afghanistan, et cetera, from 90 to 98. If you had discharge with a VA service disability, if you're in Vietnam from 62 to May 75, you get it. If you had head and neck radiation treatment, you can get it. If you were at Camp Lejeune during a certain period where their water was actually horribly poisoned, which my brother, a veteran of 26 years, tells me that the funding for the wall will take the money not to halt the Camp Lejeune water contamination, echoing our problems in Flint, Michigan. So that ability to fluctuate this incredibly labyrinthine eligibility requirements is of course very complex. In terms of being able to take care of aging facilities, I went to medical school and I went out to a rural clinic back in 1970s, where back in those days, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, when they saw a need, they went out and they set up trailers. They set up trailers in the Central Valley of California. They set up trailers in the Yakima Valley here. And they expanded to meet fluctuating needs, not with, super expensive, many billion-dollar facilities, but with sometimes temporary, because hopefully the need will fluctuate if we can ever turn off this continuous war.
Okay, solve that problem. No, those are good. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. Let me probe on this. So, Steve, I think you mentioned how, the base closure thing and how it's like impossible to close a military base. Communities and their political leaders rally around and say, no, this one's necessary, close somebody else's. And actually healthcare, just in general, forget about the VA, healthcare in general is also subject to the same sort of parochialism. It's very hard for public officials to close rural hospitals, for example. So what they do is they, of course, turn to the private sector and they allow, management companies to take over the hospitals and then close them down. But you sort of all mentioned the fact that, the needs of veterans has changed, will be changing. Maybe the population will be shrinking. I don't have a lot of confidence in that, given our propensity to go to war. And so what ideas do you have for how to keep a health system nimble enough to provide adequate care when you can't really do that through bricks and mortar itself or only? You've got to figure out some other ways. So the Choice, Act was an attempt to provide some nimbleness, and I guess, somebody thought the what's the next one? The Mission Act was, but the point, sort of set aside those political hot potatoes. What ideas do you have that would actually allow a system as complex and large as the VA to be nimble enough to serve people who need to be served adequately?
Do you want us to go the same way?
No, I just want somebody to answer. We only have about 5 minutes.
Well, I think that, there have been propositions there was a commission on care mandated by the Choice Act, where the commission came up with the idea of doing some pilot programs where you would use underutilized facilities to care for families of veterans. I agree completely with Kelly. Although I do think families of veterans do benefit from VA care in ways that we don't see. But I think that you could create pilot programs in underutilized facilities where you...
Are you talking about underutilized private facilities?
No, VA facilities. I mean, if we have a problem with underutilization, and by the way, I really think, there are a lot of assumptions here, and you raised one, Aaron, that we are going to have a dwindling, veteran population. How do we know that? I mean, given our country's propensity to jump into conflict. And also, as I think anybody who's a physician on this panel and anybody who's a caregiver in the audience knows, you can have a dwindling population that has higher needs. You know, I mean, the veterans of today have way more problems because of our amazing ability to triage on the battlefield. I mean, people who would have died in Vietnam or World War II or Korea live today with horrendous chronic problems. So, you know, I also think, so I think that there can be experiments with, you know, with adding families and even, you know, even non-veteran patients. Why not? I mean, you know, but, I mean, there's also telehealth, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to raise one question because we've all talked about, you know, giving the right to care to all Americans. I think one of the fundamental unanswered things that this country hasn't dealt with is actually calculating the real cost of war, right? And the real cost of war includes like a very well-funded as opposed to underfunded VA. And we have refused to do that as a country.
Okay, Steve?
So I think, you know, the VA, and Hugh kind of mentioned that, what it actually has done historically quite well is innovate. And I think the opportunities to innovate have been withheld from the organization for a couple of decades. You know, it's still, I think, there and could be unleashed. You know, one of my great disappointments is with the new EHR is that VA is not allowed, is not being permitted to bring the innovation to it, which needs to happen. You know, one great innovation I thought that Jim will know about that was planned was actually not to build a hospital in Denver. The original plan actually was to lease hospital space from the new Anschutz Medical Center, which was built down the street, so the VA could have flexible hospital space, could share laboratory and radiology facilities, and then be able to flex up and down. You know, the VA pioneered in building these super clinics. There's one in Ohio where, you know, it's got all but inpatient beds. And VA may not necessarily need to be in the inpatient business in some communities. There's also been a lot of talk about figuring out what the VA does well and what actually would be better provided in some other settings, and give local VAs the opportunity to sort of make those decisions and have some flexibility. So, I mean, and I think, as Hugh said, the informatics, the telehealth, the scan echo programs, you know, all the informatics advances. To me, actually, that's what the VA could do. That's the leadership that the VA could provide, just as it had before, in sort of being able to experiment without the same financial risk as private healthcare systems. And I think there could be lots of improvements.
Again, I'm very short.
Very
Jim?
short.
No, Jim and then Hugh.
Oh.
Really short. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hugh and then Jim.
At Deception Pass State Park, there's a museum to the Civilian Conservation Corps. It takes political will and leadership. 300,000 young men in this country were put to work in the course of less than 6 months in the CCC. And so, can we be nimble? We have been nimble. We just have to be nimble again.
Jim?
Yeah, I
Last
was just
word.
going to say, you know, I think that I have a lot of confidence actually in the projections around the veteran population. We don't fight wars the way we did in World War II and Vietnam. But I think that, you know, on the front of the VA building in Washington, D.C. is the mission statement for the Department of Veterans Affairs, handed down by Abraham Lincoln. And it sounds a bit sexist today, but, you know, it was Abraham Lincoln, which is, you know, to care for he who bore the battle, for his widow and his orphan. That's the mission of the VA. It's not about the brick and mortar that sits on the hill down the road. It's about that mission, right? It's about taking care of Kelly and her brothers and sisters. And I think that VA going forward is going to have to partner with private sector to be able to do this. I just, you know, Steve said it, the buildings are not in the right places anymore. I was on a group in Oregon going around and looking, doing town hall meetings around the state to talk about how things could be improved as people left the Guard. And I met this young man out in Pendleton, Oregon, who had his leg blown off by an RPG. And he wanted to know why he couldn't text message his doctor and get help, and why he had to go to Portland to get a new prosthesis. And it wasn't so he could walk around, it was so he could snowboard. I think the expectations of a new generation of veterans are just very different, and I don't think VA is going to be able to do it by trying to sustain the organization that it has today.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Now it's your turn. So we have about a little over half an hour for your questions. Here's how it's going to work. Molly and James have mobile mics. So raise your hand if you have a question. Be patient for them to come around. They are not going to give up control of that mic. So I learned this from Denny Heck, who's a congressman from Olympia, but he used to, when he ran TVW, which is our public access TV, he moderated a lot of panels that I was on, and he walked around a room and he held on to that mic, and he didn't give up control of that mic. So that's what James and Molly are going to do. You have an opportunity to ask a question. So be thoughtful about how to frame that question succinctly. If you start running on, making a statement, I will cut you off and they will take the mic away. Okay? Fair enough? Yes. All right. So, who's got a question? Oh, McClanahan. Anyways, they're gonna find you.
Medicare for All is in the wind, and Bernie Sanders' bill and Pramila Jayapal's bill do not integrate the VA system or the Indian health system right away, but they, I think, make allusions to this can be done in the future. Is this something that you see happening in the future, that the VA facilities such as we have on Beacon Hill will become part of the Medicare for All system as a hospital where anybody can go to? Do you see that the veterans are so special that they need something that's totally separated from a fabulous Medicare for All system?
Okay, who would like to respond?
Well, that's a debate in and of itself, and I'm not sure what's meant by Medicare for all. I think Jim's right. There are things the VA can do that aren't done well in the private sector and vice versa, and integration would be important. One of the things that was floated in the Obama administration was consolidation of all the federal health care facilities, IHS, VA, DOD, HHS facilities, and creation of a federal health system, which might be an intervening step to integrating more with the private sector. I'd be curious to what other people think.
I'll answer the question about the specialness of veterans. Yes, we're a very special group. The answer, I would say, is both yes and no. I would say there are some complexities and some nuances that are unique to veterans, and so they do need some targeted kinds of care in that sense. On the other hand, everybody needs a primary care provider. So there are some ways that there's the basics. The basics kind of don't necessarily change depending on who you are. And this sort of ties into the previous question about the nimbleness. And if we plan take me for example, like if we plan the fact that I'm going to need a primary care provider based on the fact that I was born instead of based on my veteran status, then it decreases the need for the VA to be so nimble in the first place. Because the planning is long range instead of waiting for 9/11 to happen or waiting to see how well I integrate or don't integrate when I come back from my deployment. So So I think I think it's a yes and a no.
So I think, Steve alluded to this earlier in his opening comments, and I think the one thing that would allow the physical footprint of the VA to probably last longer than it otherwise might is if those facilities could care for families of veterans, that a spouse could take their Medicaid or Medicare benefits and go to that facility, or their commercial insurance and go to that facility. If potentially other people in the community, it would be kind of an alternative revenue stream that would help support those facilities in communities. I think Seattle has enough population that the Seattle VA is probably secure for years and years to come. But in smaller communities, I think allowing facilities to extend the population they're serving probably would help preserve those places and also preserve some of the unique services that they and only they can provide veterans.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thing, is that actually veterans have been having choice for a very long time, right? When they turn 65, they get the choice to take Medicare. The number of veterans going to the VA has actually increased, not decreased, which I think says something about, how people might be voting with their feet.
Right.
I'd like to respond to that question. When I started writing about VA healthcare, I didn't know that much about veterans. And one of the things that over the past 10 years I've been really impressed by is how different veteran problems are from, from the average person who isn't a veteran. Now, and the people who go to the VA, and I believe that under a Medicare, whatever we want to call it, Medicare for All system, you would do away with the eligibility requirements, so anybody who's a veteran could go to the VA. And they also wouldn't have to go to the VA. They could go anywhere, right? And but I think that what has really impressed me about hanging around veterans hospitals is veterans have we talk about population health, right? And veterans are a very particular population. They have more problems, and I have been impressed and depressed by some stories about the inadequacy of the private sector to even recognize those problems. I've been a patient since I was able to, let's say since I was 18, I'm 73, nobody's ever asked me if I was in the service. Nobody's ever asked my husband if he was in the service. How do they know, right? I have a friend who's a Vietnam veteran who, very typical story, had PTSD, went to the VA, got better, had a very strong career in the private sector, had private sector health care, retired. Guess what? It came back. It often does when people have a lot of time on their hands, goes to his PCP in the private sector and complains of insomnia and nightmares and is given Ambien, And he didn't even know he was a veteran. I'm not a doctor. I could have diagnosed PTSD. So I do think that there are very specific problems that veterans have, and that they need people who are well-versed in those problems. And I think you're right. You're all right. We have to have private-public partnerships, but these partnerships have to be real partnerships. They can't be taking money from the VA to enrich the private sector. And I think that is something that's extremely important for us to keep in mind.
Great, thanks. Next question.
I won't touch the mic. So my question revolves around the Department of Defense and the Defense Health Agency that I know is standing up. And I think you touched on it briefly, is there any plans to look at joint DHA, VA, use of facilities, skills, so that, because there is problems within the Department of Defense in terms of skill degradation in certain areas where they don't get to practice enough for like general surgery and trauma. So is there any crosstalk going between the two?
Jim, you're probably.
I don't know.
So I used to work for DHA, so I can tell you yes.
Okay.
Long-term planning, and it's based on a political football. Oh, hi. Hey.
I'll let you have that mic. Yeah, so the answer is yes. It is very dependent on the political football, and it's very dependent on fixed facility costs, which is why it's very interesting what you're bringing up about joining the beneficiaries populations within the locale. I do agree that would reduce fixed facility costs, and also, just like you're saying, cost sharing. So currently, it's an MOU locally to do that exact thing, but it does depend on that local VA leadership to sort of engage at that level. But long-term planning, absolutely, DHA is interested in that.
Thank you.
And that's the most I can really say about
Thank
that.
you.
There are, I was going to say, there are a few places around the country where VA and DOD have joint facilities, in Hawaii and Alaska, and a few other places in the country. And I think there are economies of scale that come about from those relationships.
All right, another,
And in terms of, there is cooperation too between private or university hospitals and the DOD in terms of training, both of residents and also reciprocal relationship where, at least in my field of trauma surgery, trauma surgeons will go visit in actually not in the frontline theater, but actually places like Launchstool and other bases around quaternary centers in the country to help lend expertise. Times of peace, we train Army residents. Time of war, they train us, and it's just, it's a give and take phenomenon.
And there's also partnerships between the DOD and the VA in rehab, because the Department of Defense hospitals don't do rehab, so polytrauma, for example, it's filled with active duty service members who might have gotten in motor vehicle accidents and so forth. I mean, most people aren't aware of, I think, those kind of partnerships.
thank you. Okay, another question.
Hey, David. This question's mostly for Kelly, but my question is that, especially in my work, I'm a caseworker and I do outreach for for Congresswoman Jayapal, and what I've noticed, especially amongst the 20-something and 30-something veterans, is that a lot of them don't even go to the VA, and I think a lot of that is because of reputation. You have other vets who might have had a negative experience, and if I know anything about government, you're going to remember what we do wrong more than you're going to remember what we do right. That just is a fact of life. So my question to you is, how if we're going to have the VA continue to be successful in the future, how do we make the VA appealing to people of your generation, and how do we make the VA more accessible to young folks, because the VA is still very much geared towards the Vietnam era veterans, and it's like you're speaking a different language, because the only way you're going to get to veterans, and I know it sounds silly, is Instagram or on social media or other things, because that's where they are, but the VA and our government just hasn't caught up to them yet, and it's part of why I think the suicide rates are so horrifying, and they're only climbing, especially amongst women veterans as well.
The VA is a mysterious beast, and I was one of those 30-somethings who, no longer a 30-something, but who was going to never set foot in the VA, like I would have died than have gone there, and it almost came to that. But I think the issue, I'm not sure Instagram is like the solution. I think part of the challenge is collective wisdom. And so we have a very small number of veterans. There's not that many, and there's a lot of, I think, ethical and moral reasons for that, some of them not very good, because we just contracted out a lot of our war, and we should have more veterans. But there's not that many, and especially if you're a Guard and reservist, and I was in the Guard, you return back and you're not necessarily surrounded by folks who have know-how around the healthcare systems. Like, even to this day, my base community knows nothing about the VA. So there's no collective wisdom, like, oh, go see so-and-so. Oh, this is the form you fill out, and you go to office number 14, and that's where you get it, and then you fill it out. Like, I really stumbled my way in and then began to figure it out, only because I had no other health care. It was trial by fire. But I don't think I'm unique, especially being a Guard and Reserve person, you return back to a community that doesn't necessarily have anyone around you who can just give you those basics like, oh, this is how it works. Oh, this is what you do. You just walk in the door. Like, I mean, people say, oh, just go visit the VA and sign up. And you're like, well, what actually does that mean? Where do I go? And what office do I go to? And who do I talk to? And how do I sign up? And are they just going to say, oh, you're not eligible? I mean, just, there's a lot of pieces to it. And so I do think everyone has their responsibilities, and the VA does have its fair share of responsibilities for needing to reach out and get the message out. But I also think there's a challenge there that if you're only one in your community and there's no one else, how are you ever going to learn about what the VA has? I have a colleague here, Mike, from Veterans for Peace, and him and I had a conversation a month ago because I was complaining. I was saying, boy, I really wish the VA had eye care, like vision care.
The VA does.
Yeah.
And Mike said, they have vision care. And I said, oh, well, they really shouldn't like hide it and just put it in a place in the building that no one can find it.
So,
At which point he explained, it's just to the right off of the front entrance, right? So I've been part of the VA for years, but didn't know that it was right there and available all the time because my neighbor doesn't go to the VA, and my other neighbor who has vision care can't say to me, oh yeah, it's just right off the right. I have to wait till I encounter Mike at our Veterans for Peace meetings to find out that there's vision care. So that's a long answer, perhaps.
can I just
Go ahead.
say something about this? Because
Then
I
do.
think this is a really important issue that people have to understand. I mean, I don't know how many people, we printed this fact sheet here. Because, I mean, this is probably an extremely educated audience, right? But we felt that the people who organized this and the participants felt that a lot of people, you know, the VA is the biggest healthcare system in the country, and a lot of people have seen the sign VA hospital and haven't got a clue what goes on. I just spoke to 2 people today who are in healthcare and thought Walter Reed was a VA hospital. These are educated healthcare professionals. Walter Reed is an Army hospital, right? So, you know, part of the problem is that we are completely ignorant of the VA, most Americans. I was one of those Americans. The VA is not allowed to market and advertise. They have a hugely restricted advertising and marketing budget, and you have to go through a million hoops. The average large VA hospital has 2 public affairs officers, whereas a place like UW, God knows how many there are, 100? I mean, you know, the average 200-bed hospital spends $1 million on advertising a year. Do they need to do that? Probably no. Does the VA need to do that? Probably yes. You know, so there's a lot of, I mean, you know, I think I recommended to the Congressperson Jayapal that, you know, somebody in Congress has to remedy this situation of the way the VA is being asked to compete with the private sector with its hands tied behind its back and its feet in shackles. You know, I mean, it cannot get the word out because it is understaffed and underfunded in that regard, in the getting the word out.
You?
Grassroots organizations, Veterans for Peace, your local VFW. My brother is a Vietnam veteran and retired after 26 years of service in the reserves and the Guard. In his rural community at the VFW, he and his fellow Vietnam veterans and others have group therapy, group sessions where anybody can drop in, and now they're counseling a lot of Gulf War vets. So there are resources out there outside of the VA as well, in as remote a community as you can imagine, where these people help people who are trying to reintegrate into society. And you know, traditionally, I don't think we've done that formally. Suzanne documented that well in her book about how the VA works to reintegrate warriors back into civilian society, because it's an enormous psychological impact on people, and even as long as in Sparta that was done. So, you know, the younger vets can try the VFW and organizations like that.
Okay, let's go to another question.
Hi, thanks for coming here. My name is Mike Diedrich, and I get my health care at the VA, and I have to say that compared to my wife's health care through Kaiser, I get a better deal. Every time I go to the VA, I'm treated with respect, and that's not always the case that I got when I was on my wife's plan. The other thing is that it's an important point, I think, is some of the panelists talked about the population, the projected population of veterans, and compared to Vietnam veterans, Gulf veterans, they have served equal to or more so than the combat experience of Vietnam veterans, which was fairly extensive.
Sir, do you have a question?
Yes, and it's a comment on what some of the panelists said, and I'd like them to respond to this. The other thing is that the number of people who have toxic issues with recent wars, and also the number of, I talked to my osteo doc, and he says the arthritis prevalency among younger veterans is an epidemic. And the reason that is so is because they're carrying 100 pounds of gear almost all the time. And she says these people, according to this osteo doctor I talked to, they have the arthritis of a 70-year-old. So these are problems that will go with them the rest of their lives, in addition to the psychological problems. So I think that
Okay, let's let the panel respond.
Please.
Thanks.
Well, I think you're right. So, I mean, I think if you look at the average person during the Vietnam War, they would serve a tour or two in Vietnam, and they'd be home. Today, I know the people in the Oregon National Guard, some of them have served 6-7 tours in the Middle East. And we know that service-connected conditions, related conditions, are going to be much higher. Even though the numbers are much smaller, the service-connected conditions are going to be much higher in this population. And we definitely know that there's an exponential relationship between the time you spend in a combat zone and the development of PTSD. So I think this is going to be a huge problem for the VA and for veterans in this country. And Kelly said, we actually contracted out a lot of services. So we have a lot of people who were not in the military, not eligible for VA care, but who are citizens of this country who went over and served. And they were paid well to do that. But they are going to come back with the same problems that our military personnel have. And, I think private sector is even less prepared to serve that community of people.
Okay.
Center up there. Did you still have?
Wait, I think we had a
Person
question.
back in the back.
Go ahead.
Thank you for everything so far. Apart from the sort of anecdotal evidence of young veterans, how you did or didn't get to the VA, what do we know? What's our most current knowledge of the opinions among veterans about the VA, both those who use it and those who don't? What data do we have about that, number one? And number two, what can we do collectively to combat the attempt to have people give up on the VA by underfunding it and understaffing it and so forth? What can we do to combat that?
Okay. Steve?
So there is actually a fair amount of data, and I can speak somewhat authoritatively as I was in charge of those data for about 8 years. So the VA administers surveys both in the outpatient and the inpatient environments, which are identical, are very similar to what's done in the private sector. And you can look those up. The VA puts them up on Hospital Compare, and you can look at the CHAPS, the HCAPS and the CAPS scores. To summarize briefly, actually, if you look at satisfaction with care, it's comparable across systems. The one actually interesting area where VA lags behind is in the perceptions of access, which seems to run counter to the actual data. And I think that gets back to what people were saying, is that, there's been a lot of negative press about the VA. And actually, when Phoenix happened, we saw satisfaction with care take a deep dip almost immediately, which suggested to me that, veterans were being influenced by what they were reading or listening to in the media. But the data suggests that veterans are highly content and satisfied with the care they get, just as most people are with their medical care outside the VA. I'll let someone else talk about how to sort of reverse that. I think Suzanne's right. It's something that in the VA, I think, like we've seen in the media, it's hard to fight back really as a governmental agency, and I think the VA largely is sort of and maybe correctly decided it's got to be a punching bag because there's not much recourse.
Well, the DOD certainly has a lot of resources to promote its wars and so forth. It has no problem with that, and it's a governmental agency. I agree, Steve, that, the patient satisfaction scores are high, and also the surveys from veterans. VFW just did a recent survey. There's a whole bunch of surveys that show that veterans as a whole don't want the VA privatized, but strengthened and improved. Your question about how can it be stopped, it's a political issue, and it demands political will and political action. Veterans have to, and veterans, and not just veterans, families of veterans, and the people in this room who aren't veterans, and supporters of national health care. If we care about the VA, and I care about the VA because I believe, I have a bumper sticker on my car, I love my VA and save our VA. I'm not a veteran, but I believe it is my VA. I pay for it in my taxes. I benefit from, thank you for the shingles vaccine, VA, that I got. I don't have a pacemaker, but if I did need one, I'd be grateful too. And we owe it to veterans. It's simple. You call, we have staffers in this congressional staffers in this room. What do you do when you want to affect, you should answer that question. What do you do when you want to affect policy? You get on the phone, and you make a phone call. I do this routinely. It takes 5 minutes to call, your congressperson. You work with veterans groups. VFP, Veterans for Peace, is working all over the country. It's no different than, getting the vote and abolishing slavery and getting a national health care system. It's not going to happen by ESP. We have to tell people what we want. I think it's very important to support Congress people and senators who are voting the right way too. We never call Bernie Sanders or Raul Grijalva or Nancy Pelosi to say thank you for voting against the Mission Act, which I think more people should have done. But I don't think it's a mystery how we get more funding, how we get changes in policies, how we get other than honorable discharge veterans covered. You have to be active citizens in a democracy.
Okay.
I would just like to add, I think it starts with leadership. Leadership within the VA. The average undersecretary for health serves 4 years, and then it's replaced. There's no private sector company, forget healthcare, no private sector company that turns over a CEO every 4 years. It starts with political leadership. And I think that the media and the VA get a lot of mileage out of taking the VA apart. And rather than, I'll tell you, during the whole Phoenix thing and with Choice, I was front and center in all of that. And it was a political circus. I came away from that experience not believing that very many of the people that I sat and testified before were really interested in fixing the problems. I think they were more interested in the political mileage they got out of beating up the VA on C-SPAN. I honestly believe that. There were a few who really were, who would come down after the meeting. I'm not going to endorse any candidates, but would come down after the meetings and say, I know you're trying to do the right thing. What can I do to help you? But it was 1 or 2 people.
Okay, we have time for one short question and maybe a short answer.
You mentioned families and families of veterans. What sort of systems do you have in place to help caretakers who have veterans who have very complex issues such as being a paraplegic? And if that system is in place, how could it be improved?
I couldn't hear your question, I'm sorry.
What sort of system do they have in place for family members who have veterans who have very complex issues such as being a paraplegic? And if they do have that system, how could it be improved to support them?
Well, the VA has, long been specialized in spinal cord injury. I think the expertise exists there, and I think many recognize the VA as a leader in that area. In terms of capacity, I really can't say, and I think if eligibility were being expanded, that would be a big issue, is how would the VA expand its capacity to take care of both the sort of simple and chronic problems of family members.
Well, one of the interesting things about the eligibility requirements in the VA is that there is, in priority group 4, veterans who suffer a catastrophic injury who would not be eligible.
Well, she's talking about the family members.
Right, but
Right.
I know 2 veterans who were quadriplegics and who basically the meter ran out in private sector care for acute rehab, who would have been sent home and would have had been tremendous burdens on their family, and they ended up getting care in the VA. One of their family members is being paid to care for them. Another one got a whole lot better, so that took a huge burden off the family. And there is, under Mission Act, a program, and the VA has a program for family caregivers to give them health insurance, training, and case management, and is there something else? And money, a certain stipend. It's not clear that there will be enough funding for it, but it was only exclusively for post-9/11 veterans, and now it's been expanded to veterans of all eras. And that's another system that helps caregivers of very seriously injured veterans. I mean, Jim, you may know more about that than I do. But.
Okay. Thank you for those questions. They're great questions. Thank you for responses, panelists. So I'm going to give the panelists one last opportunity to say their piece about the discussion, their thoughts. We're going to start with Hugh. You've got 2 sentences.
Oh my goodness. 2 sentences.
And-
You said 2 minutes.
No, I said 2 sentences.
Oh, my
and,
goodness.
and I'm very hard on run-on sentences.
Okay. Oh, commas. I think the VA should be continued, maintained, improved, and adequately funded. I think the innovation and education that they have provided for generations of physicians in this country should not only continue but should be expanded as we face healthcare provider manpower crunches that lie just over the horizon.
Period. Good.
I'm going to play on top of Hugh's comment that we really haven't talked much about education and training. And I would encourage you to look at your handouts for the statistics, but privatizing the VA would be an utter disaster for our medical schools and health professions trainings programs, and we just didn't get a chance to talk about that.
For me, it comes down to which field do we till in? Like, which is the field that requires our effort and our energy and our problem solving? And for me, it's the VA field. That's what needs to get our attention. That's what needs to get our efforts and our energies.
Thank you.
I think the VA is going to have to really reinvent itself to continue to care for those who bore the battle. And that's going to really take, I think, tremendous leadership, both politically and within the organization, to do that.
I clearly, obviously favor continuing the VA and strengthening and improving it. I think the VA is constantly transforming itself. I mean, if you look at women's health, 7% of VA patients are women, and they're creating an entire healthcare system for women. I don't think you would see the private sector doing that. I don't think the private sector is equipped or particularly interested in handling the complex problems of veterans. So if we want to serve those who've borne the battle, I think we have to strengthen, fund, staff the VA, and make sure that the private sector does have the appropriate kinds of partnerships and integration with the VA to serve the nation's veterans and all of us.
Thank you. Okay, so you can congratulate yourselves in a second. So we're going to go back to that question, that matrix that you responded to at the beginning, and do it again. See where your thinking is at.
I have a copy of that on your computer, right?
Yeah.
Can I have it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to just give me your email address?
Yeah. I'll give you my copy.
Okay.
No change.
Some people left the first square.
Well, I'm the opposite of a data guy. And so, I mean, the center of gravity in the room has shifted. Now, a few people have left, so the sample population is no longer the same as we started. And I actually have, I'm not able to count, I don't know how many responses.
There were 70 for the first one and 61
Okay, 51 so far. But there you go. I'm not sure exactly what you conclude from that, but it's clearly been a great discussion. Let's thank our great panelists. And I want to thank you all for being here, for participating so well. There's an email. Do we have the email thing? That's the go. And on a card, if you have thoughts about this forum, I think there's an email address. Oh, it's on this card. It's uwchips.org. But I think, wasn't there an email address? Well, there's an email on the website. And if you have ideas for the forum for next year, please tell us what you think they are. Great. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Oh, survey. Oh, complete the survey before you leave, please.